Good morning and welcome to the first Sunday of the month, the first Sunday month in review, an outlook ahead of the sixth season of the Daily Energy Markets podcast. And we have a week behind us and a month behind us, but certainly a week in which we saw a significant enough sell-off on oil after reaching above $69 on the 2nd of September. And since then, it's been a downward hill. Ever since the noise emerged that OPEC Plus may even be considering further supply increases since they've just wrapping up this month of September through this second and third quarter, they have been increasing supply quotas by 2.2 million barrels a day. They've now reached the end of that, at least they will at the end of September, and now they're soon to make some announcements about what they're going to do in the fourth quarter. And ever since rumors came out that they were going to increase further into the fourth quarter, prices have started falling through the last week. Let's kick off, as always, this month in review to Mr. Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar, Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Of course, we had to drag him in off the beach to say, halas, enough there, Christoph, summer's over. While we were all away, Christoph, is there anything that stood out before we get into the weeds of the news of the week or the most imminent things to deal with? What do you take from the period in which we've been away that sort of stands with you as we're here in early September that makes you think that was a noteworthy something that happened while we were all away?
The news cycle has become so short that noteworthy is, gives me now 2 hours of talk straight, but I won't go there. When I think about it, so let's go from the inside out and let's start sort of with now infamous geopolitics. So of course, the one thing which stands out is the helplessness of Trump's interference in trying to stop the Ukraine war. And on the other hand, it's probably fair to say now the ruthlessness with which Israel exploits its special relationship with the US and this Trump helplessness in order to close the conflict in Gaza out, if I can call it that. And I think what we have seen here is that Trump is not only being played by Putin again, we're also seeing that there's really not very many options of what he can do short of decisive secondary sanctions on Russia, and all indications are that he is not willing to go there. We have seen Peter Navarro coming forward, acting like as a mouthpiece for the administration, I think, when he wrote a op-ed in the Financial Times a few weeks ago, bashing India.
That certainly feels like a noteworthy part of the summer. I thought it was part of the silly season of the summer. When I saw that headline first, I was like, no, some junior editor has got this wrong. But clearly, no, it was very real.
You know, it was when I read it first, this op-ed, I recommend this to read everyone. I was impressed because it was pretty hard hitting and so on. Then I put on The Economist and I thought about it. So here we have a country which, let's assume all of this is true, buys cheap Russian oil, refines it, and then makes a windfall by selling it abroad. If that wouldn't be the case, and if instead another country named China would buy that cheap Russian oil, refine it and sell it at home, the impact on global markets would be exactly the same. It doesn't make any difference. So it is a clearly piece just driven by, so taking a moralistic stance, if you can call it that, but driven by politics. And then in the subsequent meetings, I mean, we all have been there now after 3 years of this war and of sanctions and of the West's unwillingness to live with higher oil prices. We know how it could be changed and how to stop Russian exports. And we know that it would be costly for those imposing the sanctions. That's the oil-consuming nations of the world. And we seem to learn again and again the taco politics that Trump in the end doesn't follow through. That's one lesson, and that means that the Europe sort of threw itself into the picture again, and now is busy trying to think about security guarantees. But all it shows is also the irrelevance and the helplessness of this European approach, which cannot really go anywhere without a US decision on secondary sanctions. So that's another.
Well, let's go to Mark and get a sense from his summer, sitting on those lovely beaches in the Gulf of Mexico, I was going to say, but can't say that anymore. The Gulf of America, there must have been, you had to change all your signs. But Mark Finley, non-resident fellow of Baker Institute of the Rice University, really thank you so much for joining us on this month in review. Again, the same question, just sort of looking back on the big window of summer from an America point of view. I mean, that Epstein story came in large, and it's like the one thing that seems to be sticking into Trump. I don't think it's got much to do with the energy markets, but what do you take away that was noteworthy through the silly season? Because oil prices ultimately are exactly where they were when we all went to the beach in early July.
Hi, Sean. Nice to see you again. And thanks for having me. Yeah, I think for me, some of the key takeaways of the summer were, as you described here, here in Washington D.C. It's Trump, the administration's efforts to bend the institutions of American governance and society to its will. Both the institutions of government, including the courts and the Congress, as well as corporate America and media in universities, you name it. And of course, that has implications for geopolitics that Christoph has described. But I think it also has had implications for energy as well. Including, there's energy ramifications of the recently passed, one big beautiful bill, as well as changes on the regulatory front. But still, markets matter. And so, I think for oil, the big story has been almost all observers have been expecting a big surplus to emerge in the marketplace, and it hasn't. Seems to be the case, that China.
When you say surplus, you mean supply surplus?
Excess, exactly. Excess supply appears to be the case that China, as it frequently does, Chinese companies have been buying on the dip and stocking up. And so one of the questions is, does recorded inventories in places where they're not a state secret don't show a huge surplus yet? And the question is, can China continue to absorb that surplus, assuming it's real? I think more broadly, here in the United States, there have been some interesting developments on the natural gas market side and the power markets as well. We talked a little bit, about the political importance of energy prices. Just yesterday, the head of the president's National Energy Dominance Council talked about how the president looks at gasoline prices every day. And famously brags, often incorrectly, about how low gasoline prices are. But the key role that gasoline and electricity play in the inflation expectations and consumer sentiment, I think, are important stories. And then, as Christoph mentioned earlier, I think there are concerns about the integrity of the data that we use as analysts in looking at these marketplaces. I mean, the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics was fired over the summer, after an unhappy jobs report. And at the Energy Department, the Secretary of Energy took the unprecedented step of criticizing his own department's long-term outlook when it was published.
You can't send me bad data. If I don't like it, it must be wrong. Is clearly a great concern. And let's talk about a big data point, Christoph, that has just come out in the last few days, of course, is the big data point that everybody was waiting for to confirm the other big event that I think take place in August, in the August doldrums, was the shift from a resistant Fed in the US to further cuts to a very compliant Fed. And that was the expectation in the markets, and that was reaffirmed on Friday when the jobs numbers for August came out, and they were pretty disappointing. We saw oil sell off significantly over 2% perhaps. But nonetheless, your thoughts as we come out of the summer now with this idea that the U.S. economy, the bionic U.S. economy, may finally be weakening. How do you read that dilemma? Going to get cheaper money with rate cuts, but weaker economic growth. Which of those two is the oil market going to follow?
I think the picture, so that on the geopolitical side, we said he's basically pinned himself in a corner, can't do much. The economic picture also becomes clearer and clearer, and it has sort of two main developments. One is that we see on the real side of the economy a continuous decrease in job openings, increase in unemployment, decrease in production increases, and GDP growth. So that points much and more towards a recession now. And at the same time, we see on the inflation side, much less inflation growth than was expected by many, much less pressure on inflation immediate, and much less of the immediate tariff impact. And what happens here, I think, is very simple, that in this current economic environment, the implementation of tariffs, when you think about it, need not necessarily conceptually be inflationary, because a change in a tariff is a one-off change in a price. It does not.
That's what the Fed argued in their Jay Powell statement a few weeks ago. That that was like they said a few years ago on the other part. It's not sticky. It's a one-off, so we're not really worried about it.
It doesn't need to translate into a price cost spiral in the way wages do or other costs. So it can be a one. And in reality, it will always somewhere in the middle. Right? But it seems to be that the inflationary impact is more of the one-off character so far. We haven't seen much. Also, one has to account it's staggered. It's not all coming at the same time. And in an environment where the real economy gets weaker, there's much less scope for companies to actually increase prices. So all of that tempers inflation a little bit, and the pressure turns more towards the real side of the economy. And that gives a big argument or support to those who argue that the Fed is running late and has to cut. But it also, when you come back to oil prices, seems to indicate that we have now a picture emerging where the demand side from economic growth, at least in the biggest consumer in the US, is weakening, with consequences for the rest of the world, where the inventories are sort of stabilizing and rising. And as Mark has pointed out, driven by the biggest unknown there, by China, probably pretty well supplied already. We could see that developing first. So it seems that pressure on the oil market is coming, as it has been predicted by many, also from the supply side, of course, but now also from the demand side, if a little later than many people had expected.
Mark, looking at that point, I mean, the idea of now that the gateway to rate cuts, not just cut, seems wide open after the jobs number on Friday. All markets, certainly financial markets, equity markets, loving it. Gold loving it even more, and has been all on a tear for a while. Looking out in the back garden, crying in the corner, is Little Oil, who doesn't want to join the party. Is Little Oil now going to join the party here, or what's going on that oil cannot benefit from this sort of generous, liquidity pumped Trumpian era? Where do you see oil going now that we're going to go deeper into a rate cut cycle?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I completely agree with what Christoph said about the transitory nature of, the price pressures. I would note that even
let me just record for posterity. I completely disagree with both of you. Inflation is everywhere.
Well, where I was going, though, Sean, is inflation is still an issue. I mean, during the Biden administration, when inflation spiked to 9%, it was transitory, but it still had huge implications for the electoral cycle. And so,
can I interject? Because I'm not saying there will be no inflation. It's coming a little bit later, and it comes from a different source. It's not coming from the tariffs. It's coming from this ridiculous deficit financing and from the long-term debt burden, which can't be controlled forever.
Which, of course, and one must also be in that conversation that 3% is serious inflation. The 9%, what we saw during that crazy COVID years and all that was involved in that, but this upward momentum in its base. But Mark, please continue. Right. Didn't mean to interrupt you.
Right. Well, and at that time,
I just hate when my panelists agree with each other. That's why I have to interject and bring some targeted interruptions. But go ahead. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, and a big part of the volatility of U.S. consumer price inflation has been exactly gasoline prices. And President Trump campaigned on the promise of we're going to get prices at the pump down, and we're going to drill, baby, drill. The reality is you can't have both of those things. because to get prices at the pump down, it means you have to drive the price of crude oil down. And as you drive the price of crude oil down, we've seen what happened. I mean, this year, as oil prices have fallen, the U.S. rig count has fallen by 15%. The growth of crude oil production has stalled, essentially. The Dallas Federal Reserve does a quarterly survey of the oil patch. And it was really striking. In one of their recent surveys, they asked industry, how much does it cost you to comply with regulations? Because that's been a big promise of the Republican administration, that we're going to reduce regulations. The industry said more than half of respondents said it costs them less than $4 a barrel to comply with all regulations. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're a producer and you could have an extra $4 a barrel, that's a big deal. But compared with a $15 drop in oil prices, it's not enough to offset it. And that's exactly what we've seen, is that at the end of the day, the regulation matters, but the price movements matter a whole lot more. And so where do we go from here? I think it's an interesting question about, where does demand go? I mean, there are still huge debates about the future of oil demand. I mean, even right now, OPEC is forecasting global growth of oil demand this year, and we're in September, twice as high as what the International Energy Agency is projecting.
Which is the case last year, but obviously at a much lower number.
Exactly.
In that regard. Let's just bring Christoph back in here. Christoph, I mean, the big sort of focus of this weekend is OPEC Plus meeting on Sunday to decide on what to do for the fourth quarter after increasing supply by 2.2 million barrels through the second and third quarter. That's now near done with the Saudi Arabia, the biggest part of OPEC Plus, coming out publicly over the last few days, calling for OPEC Plus to move further on increases. How does that all coexist? Low U.S. job numbers. Germany reported on Friday that their economy shrank in the second quarter, and OPEC Plus want to increase further. At least that's the noise ahead of the OPEC Plus meeting. Your thoughts on that as the growing outcome of this meeting on Sunday? How will it land in the market?
Well, there's two things again we need to distinguish. One is sort of the short-term noise, and the other is the long-term strategic moves by OPEC. These ongoing rollbacks of former production cuts, that to me belongs to a large extent in the strategic department. It's not just short-term reaction. But yes, in the short term, you're right, and everything points towards a slowdown in economic growth, not only in the US, but also in the US and globally. And then you will see all the scrambling, the corporate politics and the Trump administration, all that, to try to reverse that, and there will be pretty low success chances for that. And that will then cause more serious problems for the administration. But from OPEC's perspective, we discussed this before, do they try to discipline the others in OPEC Plus? Do they try to make a quick buck? Do they try to play politics and keep Trump's gasoline prices low and Russia alive, or is there something more strategic? And I think this, what is now loosely coming up in the press always as a new reason, which is to increase market share. There's some big truth to that. What OPEC is seeing is probably the same numbers we are looking at, which indicate, at least to me, that we are indeed very close in a matter of a few years from demand, I don't hesitate to say peaking, but at least plateauing. And once that is the case, then you want to be, as a low-cost producer, in a position where you have fully utilized capacity so that you can have freedom to maneuver, to decide whether you cut some more or whether you really have to enter, because demand is so weak, this race to the bottom, where in a shrinking market, always keep in mind, if you just want to save the same volume as last year, you need to have a higher market share to do that. And in order to get a higher market share, usually you have to outcompete on price the competition. So if they're getting ready for that, then it makes perfect sense to max out the market share. And if there's a buck to be made on the way, then why wouldn't they do it? And if there's competition to be disciplined along the way, why wouldn't they do it? But all this term, again, supply outlook for the end of this year and next year points to me that oil prices will come really under pressure.
In that decision, if OPEC are looking seriously and Saudi Arabia talking and going public with its intention or its desire, usually gets what it wants. Are we seeing in the bigger picture, as Christoph says, a divorce between Riyadh and Houston ultimately, and the Riyadh Saudi marriage that is now a decade nearly underway in this OPEC Plus agreement, that while for many years Houston have benefited from the strategies of OPEC Plus, now not so much. How do you see that bigger picture playing out if indeed OPEC Plus are going to go with another further increase, and we're hearing about layoffs by the oil majors?
I mean, it's the problem with analyzing this, Sean, is that it depends on one guy in Riyadh and what side of the bed he gets up on. And so are they going to go for market share? Are they going to go for revenue maximization? Are they trying to make nice to President Trump? Are they trying to capitalize on the relationship with Russia and the OPEC Plus? A lot of these objectives are internally inconsistent. As I mentioned earlier with President Trump's campaign promises, you can't have drill baby drill and sharp.
The reality is, of course, very few people, very few countries, very few members of this OPEC Plus 20 odd countries can actually increase supply. So it's Saudi, it's UAE, it's maybe on the margins Kuwait, but not quite as much yet. But there isn't a lot. There's on paper cuts to be unraveled, but there isn't a lot of production to be brought back outside of those big countries. But how it lands in Texas, this idea that price maximization may be over.
Oh, well, I mean, look, in the comments of that Dallas Federal Reserve survey that I mentioned earlier, I would encourage our audience, if they're not aware of that survey,
we'll share it.
We'll survey and read the comments. I mean, people in the industry are saying, "I didn't vote for this. Where did this come from? This is a tough environment here." And while it's certainly the case that the industry's costs will go down as the rigs are laid down, what the industry is reporting is that actually their costs are going up because tariffs are raising costs of things like imported steel. So there's
cheaper money, cheaper rates won't be a game changer for Texas?
Sure, cheaper rates will matter. Improved regulatory processes will matter. Reduced taxes will matter. But all of that is second place behind movements in the price of oil. And you're right. I mean, I think Christoph, I think, is right that the moves by the OPEC Plus group to increase production are a move to slowly unwind these voluntary production cuts. By the way, this group of 8, not an overall quota arrangement within the group, but they've been doing it, I think, in a very interesting way. I mean, this is not the price wars that we got used to in the past, where we saw, okay, that's it, time to punish the cheaters, time to punish the competition. Let's jack up production and crater the price. Here it's been very carefully calibrated and measured, because I think in addition to wanting to reclaim market share, I mean, we're all familiar with the big spending going on in Riyadh, with the projects like NEOM, the other reforms going on inside the country, and the budget that's needed to pay for all of that.
But
and
there's
so
now
I think
reports,
trying
for
to
example,
thread the needle.
There's now reports, Christoph, that Saudi Arabia may be looking to offload the Asian Winter Games or whatever they signed up for. Some big, they've signed up to host many major international sporting events, and there's reports in the last week that they're looking to offload one of them to Asian countries. Clearly, this lower revenue window is a challenge, particularly to Saudi Arabia, but yet they seem to be the one pushing for the increases. Obviously is the biggest actor in OPEC Plus over the last 6 months, and going on, it would appear beyond. We'll see on Sunday, but ultimately, how do those two things coexist? Are they simply going to rely on the debt markets now?
So there's again. Today is the day of two things again. I don't think these targets are internally inconsistent when we just talk about Saudi Arabia. What they're doing right now has the strategic purpose of sort of increasing market share, filling their capacity. before things come to a head. It also serves to punish the competition. It also serves to a little bit to be in Trump's good book. So they do it because all these things fall together. So it's relatively easy. That's one. The other is we should not forget, and there's actually Mark in the past who always reminded me of that Saudi Arabia in the past has for many, many years survived with huge deficits, public deficits. So yes,
budget deficits, annual budget deficits.
So yes, you wish them a round table where you would sit down with McKinsey and government representatives and discuss the 2030 plan, where do we stand on that? And it would be a disaster. But no, they don't need to immediately tighten the belt just because the oil price comes down a little bit. They have a long history. They have access to financial markets, have a history of finance, have some deficits. And I would expect that they have already started that. Even Saudi Aramco, to cover its dividend, is raising bond money. And they have ample scope to go. So again, strategically, that's a blip compared to what happens if demand really suffers more. And these OPEC research forecasts about oil demand, they're like really whistling in the dark at best.
Mark, when we look forward into the sort of the coming month, obviously the big APEC event in Singapore next week, the energy markets industry waking up after the summer, lots of narratives to go through there. I'm sure the OPEC Plus decision, especially if it's an increase, will certainly dominate the chatter there. But looking through that month or so ahead, fourth quarter, what do you think are going to be the big issues here? That is it about what can stop oil prices from falling?
Yeah, most people are just waiting, on the assumption that Chinese ability to absorb what most oil balances show is a major surplus already.
And as you said earlier, that surplus hasn't arrived yet. It's been forecast all year. Are we finally going to get to the point where you're going to open your door, there'll be a barrel of oil there?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it, Sean? I mean, if everybody's supply demand balances are right, those surplus barrels have to show up at some point, and when they do, there'll be consequences for it on prices. When or
apparently
if,
there's a large armada floating off the coast of Malaysia.
Yeah, and the Energy Department, for example, is forecasting that the price will fall to $58 a barrel by the fourth quarter. And average $50 a barrel next year. They're the only one of the big three that actually forecast prices. And so, if these balances are correct in showing a massive surplus, and if the risks to demand going forward are to the downside, as Christoph has noted, it's hard to see how OPEC accelerating production increases plus ongoing supply increases in places like Guyana, Canada, Brazil, modestly in the United States, how that squares up with anything to support prices.
Is there anything else that you see in your crystal ball over the month ahead that might be worth keeping an eye on? For example, once again, and I know it's kind of like the sort of the boy who cried wolf, but once again, the U.S. government has a debt ceiling agreement to fight. Anything else there that would be worth noting?
I mean, the risk of a government shutdown here in the United States is real, but that's more downside risk for potential demand. In terms of black swans, there's talk about potential snapback of sanctions on Iran, and or if the United States and its allies get more willing to tackle the real source of Russian revenue, i.e. oil exports. I don't see any sign of that, though, because as Christoph mentioned, it's the price at the pump that matters.
What I would like to know is oil prices have this dual face, right? So they express something like, in our case, probably a declining economy and all of that, but they can also trigger events. What I would like to understand is if oil prices if it really materializes in a form that everybody realizes, if I open my door, there's a barrel in front of it, as Sean had said, would that cause Trump to react in a way which is affecting the Russia-Ukrainian situation, for example? That's a complete unknown to me because I can't figure out why he's never doing anything. Is it because he just loves Putin, or is it that he is afraid of the...
Well, aren't they caught?
And remember, during the... I'm sorry.
Right. Go ahead, Mark.
And remember, during the pandemic, it was President Trump who brought Saudi Arabia and Russia together to end the price war when oil prices went negative. It was President Trump's intervention to get the production cuts back underway to support oil prices.
What does it tell me about his ability to use sanctions on Russia?
Well, the isn't the case where in America you have the Senate, that has a constraining element on being too generous to Russia because they have a supermajority to bring fairly substantial sanctions to bear on Russia. On the other side, you've got China. You look at the lineup we saw last week in Beijing. There's no way China wants Russia to back off from Ukraine. Nothing better than keeping the West caught up in a mire of spending and headache than turning too much of their attention to Asia. It seems that way there's so many massive forces here that are just going to keep Ukraine locked in its current sort of status quo.
Okay, but the question was, if the oil price becomes lower in the sense that everybody has this thing about oversupply in a durable fashion for a year or so, would Trump then change his policy? It would allow him to get out of his corner, but would he take that exit?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I think one of the things that we focused on here as we wrap up is, despite these so-called supply increases, right? We've seen in the last 6 months of the 2.2 million supply increases, quota increases, oil prices they've moved a bit here and there for different reasons, war in Iran, whatever else. But ultimately, over that 6 months, 2.2 million barrels, way beyond the projected demand growth of 2025. And yet oil prices have stayed more or less, give or take, around $65 a barrel. So the next round of increases might also be ineffective. Maybe final comments on that, Mark, that quota increases from here on in are not going to be significant.
Well, as you noted, Sean, the number of countries within the OPEC Plus umbrella that actually have the capacity to increase production is pretty small. But that said, I haven't looked recently, but I think, estimates of spare capacity in the world are still in the ballpark of, 4 or 5 million barrels a day, most of it in the GCC. And so, if those countries want to keep jacking up production and are willing to bear the consequences of lower prices, the option is there. It's a matter of what they pick. And like I said earlier, it's a matter of what side of the bed certain leaders get out of, that will drive that.
Well, certainly the UAE have been very vocal about their intention, having spent huge amounts of money in building up their capacity to 5 million barrels a day, and now moving beyond that. They want to use that. And so unity between Saudi, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi is a critical part of so many other things. Christoph, your final thoughts, outlook, month ahead as to that point, that even if OPEC Plus pulled the trigger here, that's unlikely to deliver too many new barrels, or maybe it will.
So I would say on the economic side, continued realization that the real economy is not doing very well, ushering in a rate cycle and expectations of more rate cuts, and then perhaps in 3-4 weeks' time, people getting around to saying, and we will see an impact on stocks stopping these high flights. On the political side,
that rate cut cycle being global or specific to the Fed? Of course, Europe has moved already.
It's still Europe has probably stopped for the time being, but it's still what the Fed is doing matters in Asia as well, of course. But on the oil side, really the unknown for a while now is if there is the spare capacity and the ability to produce spare oil, and if there is the only way to tame Russia from Trump's perspective, to really impose secondary sanctions, and he wants to avoid the pain of higher oil prices, he needs to put these things together. If he can't do it, if he can't call Saudi Arabia and say, you produce more and I cut off Russia, which is quite likely that he cannot, then would he use the exit? Would he use that opportunity if it is handed to him on a silver platter? And right now, the signs are that it will be handed to him. That's the big.
But it seems that Trump wants nothing more than lower interest rates. I mean, if there was a long list of things you'd say, tariffs, of course, is his big bark. But ultimately, low rates has been his obsession as a real estate mogul, as a president, and perhaps that's the gift that there's a big article in the Financial Times yesterday about the relationship between Trump and the Gulf. This is the big gift of low interest rates, that the Fed opens the gateway to the Fed to cut rates while energy prices remain low and don't put an upward motion on inflation. So all of these things connected in a multitude of different ways. You're never going to answer everything. But Mark Findlay, sitting in beautiful Houston, thank you so much for joining us on this first month in review of the season 6. Hopefully you'll come back again. And our anchor of this month in review, Outlook Ahead podcast on the first Sunday each month, of course, Christoph Ruhl, Senior Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Christoph, thank you. And have